be the carbohydrates. So, first of all, let's talk about what are the functions of the carbohydrates. Of course, you already know that carbohydrates are biomolecules made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and this would be in a 1:2:1 ratio. And let's talk about the function. The functions of carbohydrates can be given as following: EPMCS. So, what do you think would be the function of the carbohydrates? The letter E would be energy source. The letter P would be protein sparer. The letter M is metabolic primer. Letter C would be CNS fuel. And the last one is S for structural component. We can arrange this so that it will be easier for you to remember SPEMC or SPEMC. That will be easier for to remember the functions of the carbohydrates. The S again would be the structural component. The P would be the protein sparer, the E would be energy source, the M would be metabolic primer, and the C would be CNS fuel. So SPEMC would be an easier way to remember the functions of the carbohydrates. Going to the detail, when we talk about energy source, the carbohydrates actually the immediate fuel for any activity, particularly in aerobic activity, so that when we have intense activities like weight training or sprinting, it's the first thing that the body will use up in order to produce that energy. That is why when athletes who are who would have an event wherein they would need a lot of energy, like a marathon or as mentioned, sprinting, they would usually do carbo loading, wherein the night before they will eat a lot of pasta or eat a lot of rice, at least for Filipinos and Asians, and then this would later produce, or in the event, it will be a source of energy or quick energy boost in order for them to participate very well in their event. Another is the protein sparer. Particularly, it means that these are it spares protein because the nervous system uses the carbohydrates instead for their source of energy, and without the presence of carbohydrates, what will be problem would be the protein will go through gluconeogenesis, wherein the protein will be converted to carbohydrates or to glucose, which will then be used for production of energy for metabolism. So it spares the protein. And if you're very familiar with pictures of famine hit areas like in Africa years before, you will see children and even adults who have a very small amount of muscles in their body, almost skeleton-like. It's because of the absence of food, or the lack of food will cause them to or the body to metabolize the proteins instead of these carbohydrates. So that's the problem. It's a good thing that carbohydrates will be sparing the proteins. Another example is metabolic primer, wherein they are needed to completely burn fat. So carbohydrates actually are primers. It starts off, it causes the fats to be completely burned, because without it, it will cause the fat to be combusted or to be metabolized, resulting in ketone bodies. So that's why people who do fasting, especially in prolonged periods, would have a breath that is not so they will have not so good smelling breath, because of the ketones that have been formed due to the prolonged fast, wherein the fats are being metabolized instead of carbohydrates. Another example is CNS fuel, and when we say CNS fuel, this is the central nervous system. So this is the primary fuel for the central nervous system. And have you ever experienced the time that you did not eat, and then you feel you feel irritable, and then you are lightheaded, you feel groggy, you feel like you want to sleep? That's because the absence of carbohydrates causes the brain to have lack of energy. That's why the primary fuel of the central nervous system would be the carbohydrates. And finally, structural component. So the carbohydrates are also used for structure, especially for plants, wherein the cell wall will be made up of cellulose, while the exoskeleton of arthropods like crabs and lobsters, if you remember the very hard portions, of the outside of these organisms, these are made of chitin, which are also considered to be carbohydrates. So they can be used as structural components. So that's it for the major functions. Some other functions also happens in the biological processes or inside of the organisms. So these are two processes where carbohydrates are very important. You will see here that carbon plus water produces glucose and oxygen. On the other hand, the glucose with oxygen, it is broken down using enzymes to produce carbon dioxide and water. And you're very familiar with this. The first formula or the first equation would be for photosynthesis, where again carbon dioxide and water produces glucose and oxygen, while the glucose is decomposed or metabolized into carbon dioxide via cellular respiration. In both of these uh, formula or in both of these processes, carbohydrates, particularly glucose, will be very, very important. In addition to that, there are other different biological processes wherein plant starch can be converted to glucose. Glucose can be converted to glycogen, which would be stored in animals, in particular the liver. The glycogen can be converted to glucose, and the glucose can be converted to fats or amino acids. So simply stated, all of the biomolecules can be interconverted from one form to another. So this would allow the body to continue on living because of ability to continue on with the processes because of these interconversions that are happening. Okay, let's now go to the classes of sugar. This is very familiar with us. We discussed this already. So what are the three classes of sugar? The M, the D, and the P. You're very familiar with that. The M would be monosaccharides. The D would be disaccharide, and the P will be polysaccharides. You also need to remember the different examples at least given in the SLG. So for the monosaccharides, you have G, F, G over here, and these are single sugar molecules. You have here the first one as glucose, the second one is fructose, and the third one is galactose. So those would be for the monosaccharides. For the disaccharides, you're also very familiar with this M, S, and L. The first one of the disaccharide is M, which is maltose. The second one is S, sucrose, and the other one is L, which is lactose. For the polysaccharide, examples given here are, before we forget, disaccharides are two sugar molecules that are linked together, while the polysaccharide will have SGC as their example. So S would be starch, the G would be glycogen, and the C, of course, would be cellulose. So these are many sugars that are linked together. So we already know the classes of sugar. Let's go deep into this. So the first one will be simple carbohydrates, which we already know as monosaccharides, and this will be single sugar molecules, while the disaccharides will be a combination of two of these monosaccharides together, wherein they are linked by a covalent bond. So monosaccharides, for example, again, is glucose, fructose, and galactose. And what's very interesting is that they all have the same number of carbon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they are all hexoses. The only difference would be the other structures that you can find inside of this molecule, which causes them to have different properties from each other. So you notice here that the OH here on the left side, while for the fructose and glucose, the OH here would be on the right side. The double bond will be at the end of glucose and galactose, while the fructose will have the double bond in the middle of the carbon chain. So glucose have, because of those, the structural differences, they have different properties. So glucose is the primary source of energy. Fructose metabolized to glucose in the liver, and the galactose rarely occurs naturally as a single sugar, so it is usually combined with other monosaccharides. Okay, now let's go to the second class, which will be the disaccharides. So again, what will be the MSL? The examples given: maltose, sucrose, and lactose. So maltose would be a disaccharide of glucose units. You can find this in plants and also, of course, only in plants. So this would be two glucose units together. The sucrose would be made up of the glucose and fructose combined with the covalent bond together. The lactose would be glucose and galactose, wherein they are also linked through this. And you find this, of course, in milk. So these are examples of disaccharides. We mentioned in class that if you drink milk and then you have a stomach upset or stomach ache, usually that would be resulting from lactose intolerance because of the enzymes are no longer functioning very well inside of our digestive system. This is a problem with most Filipinos because we usually stop drinking milk after when we become teenagers, thereby causing the enzyme to be reduced inside of our digestive system. So what's the process that combines monosaccharides? We already have discussed this already, and this is actually for polymers in general. So what would be the process? You're very familiar. You call that as the condensation reaction, particularly the dehydration synthesis, wherein water is released in order to form a bond between these two. So this would be the bond between two monosaccharides, producing what we call as a disaccharides. Now, on the other hand, what if you would like to separate the disaccharide from each other? So you have to break the bond. This is what we call as the process that decomposes the polysaccharides or polymers in general. You call this a hydrolysis. You're very familiar with this. And hydrolysis will need a molecule of water in order to separate or to break the bond over here, the covalent bond, and then you will separate them where the H will be going to one of the monomer and the OH will be on the other monomer. Okay, finally we'll now go to the complex carbohydrates. So we're done with the simple sugars, we're done with the disaccharides, and down the complex carbohydrates. So just remember, glycogen can be found in animals, and starch like amylopectin and amylose can be found in plants. These are complex carbohydrates because there are so many carbohydrates, so many monomers or saccharides, monosaccharides that are connected or bound together by covalent bond. So you're very familiar with this, which one is cellulose and which one would be starch. And of course, you know that the starch would be the one on the top. So because of this particular difference, starch are stronger, dissolve in water, does not dissolve in water, and difficult to digest. That's why cows would be needing 4 stomach to digest that, in addition to the aid of the bacteria. While starch would be easily digested, dissolved in warm water, and weaker than cellulose. It's very important, very interesting that this would be resulting because of a simple difference in the way that the covalent bond have formed. Now, since we're talking about this, let's talk about fibers as well. So fibers are also complex polysaccharides, and they are indigestible polysaccharides, and they are very important for good health because it functions to clean up like a broom, to clean up our digestive system by absorbing toxin, absorbing excess cholesterol, and this is something that would be very important. So that's why we need to eat vegetables and fruits. Although fiber is lost when grain like rice has been refined. So the grains that have been refined would lose a lot of this fiber. So what's the health benefits of dietary fiber? Just to inform us, it protects us from cancer, colon cancer particularly, prevents gastrointestinal diseases, control high cholesterol, reduces inflammation, aids in weight loss, and treats piles as well. So just this is an encouragement for us to eat a lot of fibers in vegetables and also in fruits. Finally, we have what we call the sugar structure, particularly focusing on 2 of these classes. We have here the aldose and the ketose, and the aldose would be sugars that contain the aldehyde group, while the ketose would be the sugar containing the ketone group. Now, how do you distinguish between these two? This is the easiest way to distinguish that when you see the double bond O, the double bond oxygen. When the double bond oxygen would be found at the end, the last carbon, as you can see here, an H is on the right side, and the R, which would be representing all the other carbon part, the skeleton, carbon skeleton part of this molecule. If the double bond O is at the end, it will be an aldehyde, which means that the sugar is an aldose. On the other hand, if you find the double bond O in the middle of the carbon skeleton. So you have an R, which means there are other carbons here on the right, and R, which have other carbons on the left. This would tell us that this is a ketose because it is in the middle. In addition to that, we need also to know the number of carbons, and that's why 3 carbons sugar called triose, 4 carbon sugar called tetrose, 5 carbon sugar called pentose, 6 carbon sugar called hexose, and just take note, or you just need to take note the Greek words for the numbers. Like for 9, it's nona, 10 is for deca, etc. So this would be the name for the sugars depending on the number of carbons present. Notice that you just add OSE at the end to indicate that this is a kind of sugar. So let's try to name this. You're already very familiar with this, so let's try this again. So first of all, you need to count the number of carbons. So even if you don't see a carbon, the intersection will imply that a carbon is present. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you have 6 carbons here, which tells us that it is a hexose. And then you look at the double bond O where it is found. It is found at the end, which tells us that this is an aldehyde, which leads us to the name aldohexose. The second one, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have 4 carbons, which makes it a tetrose. And then you see the double bond O that is found on the middle, not at the end, because there's a carbon on the left top side and a carbon on the bottom side of the drawing. So you have a carbon here. So it is called a ketose. So it is a keto tetrose. Okay, the third one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you have 6 carbons here, and then you have a double bond O in the middle. So 6 carbohexose, it is a keto, so it's a ketohexose. And finally, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have 5 carbon, which means the pentose, and you have a double bond O at the end, an aldehyde, which make it an aldopentose. So you now know how to name sugars according